guest speaker, Brian Kearns. He spoke in this Issues in Sustainability class for probably 10, 12, 15 years. I'm going to let him introduce himself and his topic. We're in our final unit, which is sustainability as a lifestyle. And so covering just very, very broad issues like food systems, clean water, energy of the future, what's our workforce going to look like, technology, just basically how we're integrating or the integrative aspects of sustainability in these really broad-based lifestyle themes. So it's kind of a go with the flow type of topic. I'm really grateful to have Brian here to share his expertise on future energy sources, and I'm going to turn it over to him now.
Thank you, Lisa. Yeah, it's always a pleasure to speak to you and your class. Yeah, it's been over a decade, hasn't it? Anyway, it's always great. It gives me an opportunity to kind of refresh on the latest trends. I used to keep up very, very carefully with them, not so much anymore. But yeah, I'm an engineer, a facilities engineer at the University of Montana. I manage utilities, mostly electricity, natural gas, energy, have been responsible for a number of energy projects on campus. I've been involved in the new combined heat and power plant that's going in now. We've put up 8 or more smaller, mostly photovoltaic, solar voltaic panels across campus and actually on the West Campus. Yeah, so I've always been heavily involved in energy. It's a keen interest of mine, and I always enjoy sharing it and with students. Unfortunately, this is offline, so I won't be able to address questions. Well, I guess I will. I mean, if after watching this, any of the students have questions, feel free to contact me. I'm sure Lisa will provide contact information. I'm pretty available on campus. Give me a call or an email, and I'll be happy to address any concerns. I have a pretty broad and deep knowledge of what's going on campus. So if you have any specific concerns about campus energy use, what we're doing, how we're getting there, and that type of thing, yeah, give me a shout, and I'll see what I can do. So I'm going to try to find my presentation and share it. Okay. So as Lisa mentioned, I typically like to look at what I call clean tech and the trends that occur year by year, and they change actually pretty dramatically year by year. And this year is sort of a blast from the past, as a lot of things are with fashion and other things, music sometimes. I originally got involved with the University of Montana through a former dean at the College of Technology. Paul Williamson was his name. And at that time, and this is in the early 2000s, 2003, 2004, somewhere around there, he was a man ahead of his time. He was heavily into hydrogen and had a vision of a hydrogen future, and proceeded to get pretty good traction with federal agencies in getting some grant funding. He had over $4 or $5 million worth of federal grants to pursue some of his interests in hydrogen. And I was fortunate enough to be with him during that period of time and help him along in a lot of that research and development. And we did a lot of interesting things together. Unfortunately, he moved on, and things never really quite gelled back then on hydrogen. It was a very promising fuel, and continues to be. A joke we often said back then was, you know, hydrogen is the fuel of the future, and it always will be, because it seemed like every time you look at it, you know, it was always hydrogen's going to be the thing 10 years from now, 10 years from now. We've made some progress, but things never really quite gelled, and it never really took off. Although we have hydrogen cars, we have hydrogen electrolyzers and fuel cells and stuff like that. So a lot of the pieces are there and available. But again, it never quite took off in the scale that it needed to become a real commercial success. Now I think things are changing, and I'll say it once again. I think hydrogen is the fuel of the future, and I think in 10 years from now, as I said 10 years ago and 10 years before that, I think really now is the time to really watch, because a lot of things are going on, and let's walk through some of them. This is going to be very difficult for you to see. I just wanted to kind of show the image of what's happening across the world. So the climate issue is becoming more than just idle talk. It needs to advance at a much quicker pace, and I think more and more of the world is beginning to understand and realize that. So what you're looking at here is a race to carbon neutral by certain time frames, and there are some people that, or some countries, I guess, that have already achieved carbon neutrality. They're small, but Bhutan and Suriname are two countries that have not only achieved net zero, but they are negative. So that has already been done by a couple small countries. And then if you look in this part of the graph over here, I think I can do this and you can see it. There's some other countries. Uruguay is next. They've had a commitment for 2030. I don't know if you can see that. Finland is 2035. And a few things. Iceland is 2040, Germany 2045. So a couple countries are sort of leading the pack there to try to achieve net carbon zero by a certain due date. And then you see most of the rest of the world are looking at 2050. All of these here are looking at 2050 as their, and then there's a few outliers over here, China, Australia, Singapore, etc. The point of this is that, the world is taking it seriously. Now, again, some of these commitments are pushed pretty far out there so that current administrations really don't have to, sit down and grapple with it. But still, they're out there. A lot of them are actual laws that have been implemented. So there are some teeth behind some of these promises now that there really hasn't been before. So that's an encouraging trend. I'm going to erase some of this stuff. And let's move on. So this is another blast from the past. So again, Dean Williamson, Paul Williamson had the energy program, which is no longer, unfortunately, being offered by Missoula College. But this was, you see some people that were involved with the energy program, as was I was a teacher. And we did a practicum, and this was some of the people that were involved in the practicum. And they're standing in front of a hydrogen station that Paul Williamson had built, sitting right where the new Missoula College is on East Broadway. This is where that facility was. And yeah, at that facility, you only see a little piece of it there behind them. They're standing right in front of a hydrogen dispensing station. And then behind it was an electrolyzer where we took water and made hydrogen out of the water. So hydrogen is, oh yeah, always lead with a joke, right? So I have my obligatory hydrogen joke in here. maybe if nobody has studied chemistry, you won't get this, but I'll let you look it up if you. So let's talk about hydrogen and why it may be a good source for the future. So we'll mention about it in a minute, but there's a number of ways of making hydrogen. Hydrogen is the most abundant element in the universe. However, it's a very reactive element. It's also the smallest, the lightest element, and it's rarely found. Actually, and this came as a surprise to me in the last few years, you can't actually drill for hydrogen. We'll talk about that in a minute too. But for the most part, hydrogen is usually in combination with other elements and molecules. And the one that we mostly use is water. So water is 2 atoms of hydrogen and 1 of oxygen. So you can make hydrogen and oxygen from water by applying electricity to that water in a process called electrolysis. So it's most hydrogen that is made currently is not made that way. It's made in a more cost-efficient way, what's called steam reforming, where you take steam and methane, which is an element of natural gas, basically heat it together, and it splits the hydrogen off. And that's a way of making hydrogen. It's also made from coal and lignite, which is another variety of coal. Clearly, there's problems with using that. Methane, coal, are all fossil fuels, so there are carbon associated with it. However, if you electrolyze pure water, there's no carbon involved. So there's no carbon emissions involved with electrolyzing water. So that's what they call green hydrogen. We'll talk a little bit more about those colors in a minute. But there's other forms, like if you make hydrogen from coal, they call it black or brown hydrogen. From lignite, from nuclear power, you can make use the electricity from nuclear power to make hydrogen. And so the industry's kind of branding hydrogen with all these different colors depending on what its source is. But anyway, we make the hydrogen any way we can. If we make it from renewables, it's green hydrogen through a process called electrolysis. And then hydrogen is interesting in that you can use it in 2 basic processes. One is simple combustion. I'll look at combustion reactions in a minute. So you burn it, right? You just burn hydrogen. And the result of burning it is just water. So again, there's no carbon involved. So that's one process you can use hydrogen in. So where we burn things like right now, we burn oil, or we burn natural gas, or coal, we could burn hydrogen instead. A lot of times we use those processes for thermal generation of electricity. So we produce heat to boil water, to make steam, to turn a turbine, to make electricity. Hydrogen has another property, another process that can directly make electricity through what they call a fuel cell. So you can make electricity, by burning the hydrogen through this, what they call thermal generation, or through a fuel cell. So hydrogen has a way to, of supplying both those needs. And that's a pretty interesting property. Hydrogen also has a way of being like a storage battery. So, and we're finding this in parts of the world where we have a lot of wind, like in West Texas, and even like here in the Columbia Valley area in Washington, there's a lot of wind farms. And when the wind is blowing, sometimes in the middle of the night, when there's not a very big need for electricity, they have to dispatch those sources offline because they don't need the energy. If we have a process where we can keep those systems online so that they just run whenever they want to run, as fast as they want to run, And if we need the power, we use the power. If we don't need the power immediately, we still use it, but instead of using it to turn house lights on or run refrigerators, we make hydrogen. So we electrolyze water, we make hydrogen. Hydrogen is a gas and it can be stored. So we make the hydrogen, we store it, and then we can use that later on in the day, in the middle of the day, when all the lights or all the businesses are running and air conditioning is on. That's usually when the peak electric power occurs, right after noon in the day. Then we can bring some of that hydrogen that we made in the middle of the night back into the grid and make more electricity with that. So it's not only a fuel, but it's also a storage element there as well. So I was telling you a minute ago about combustion. And here I put up a number of combustion exercises just because I got a little rusty on balancing my chemical equations. So I thought I'd run through a few of them here. Hydrocarbons are what you see here. These are what they call the alkanes: methane, ethane, propane, butane, pentane, heptane, hexane, octane, nonane, decane. They go on and on and on. Those are the simplest type of hydrocarbons. And methane, this one here, is a very simple hydrocarbon, CH4. It's the primary component of natural gas. Natural gas usually contains all of these alkanes, but in smaller and smaller proportions. Majority, usually 90% or more of natural gas is methane. Then a smaller percentage, 2 or 3% is ethane, and it just keeps going down the higher you go up in these type of compounds. So methane is the simplest. And you see, if you combust, any kind of combustion reaction is you take the hydrocarbon and you add oxygen, basically air, to it. You spark it with a match or something, and you produce, if it's complete combustion, you get 2 products of combustion. You get carbon dioxide and you get water. Now, if it's incomplete combustion, then you get other things like carbon monoxide, because you didn't have enough oxygen to make it carbon dioxide. And usually, again, we're using air, so there's nitrogen in air. So depending on how you run your combustion activities, you can get NOx out here because of heat temperatures and things like that. But in very simple, complete combustion, these are the only 2 products of combustion that you get. So you see, you burn 1 molecule of methane, you get 1 molecule of carbon dioxide. The next alkane is called ethane, and there's 2 carbons in there. And here's the balanced chemical equation. So you burn 2 molecules of ethane, and you get 4 molecules of carbon dioxide. So you see, as you advance up the scale in burning more complex hydrocarbons, you get more carbon dioxide available. I didn't put them all up here. I just did methane, ethane, propane, and then octane. There's a lot of people be familiar with octane as a principal component in gasoline that you run cars on. So, and then over here, besides when you burn these chemicals, you get these products, but you also get heat, right? That's why we burn them, to get the heat. And this is what they call the heat of combustion. And don't worry about these numbers, but I just wanted to show you that also as you advance in more complicated hydrocarbons, you get more heat out of them. And then down here, I have the hydrogen combustion. Again, I said before, hydrogen is a fuel. You can use it 2 different ways. You can combust it. When you combust it, again, you have hydrogen, pure hydrogen, combust it with oxygen. All you get is water. No carbon at all. So it's a very nice, clean fuel. I mentioned that I was an engineer. I didn't mention what kind of engineer. I'm a chemical engineer by training, so I love chemistry. I mentioned before about making hydrogen. And again, the way of making mostly green hydrogen is by taking water and applying electricity to water. And on one side of this electrolyzer bubbles out hydrogen, on the other side bubbles out oxygen. And I showed you that picture of the energy technology program at Missoula College, and they were standing in front of electrolyzer. We had an operating electrolyzer, and we did this. We made hydrogen by applying electricity to it, and we stored it. We filled up some weather balloons with it at one point. We've burned it. We used it for, we had 2 hydrogen vehicles at one point in time. They were internal combustion engines, so we were burning the hydrogen. We weren't using a fuel cell, but we also had a fuel cell. So we're able to use the hydrogen in a fuel cell. It was a small one, but we're able to make electricity via the hydrogen. And basically a fuel cell is just an electrolyzer in reverse. So instead of applying electricity to it, you put, mostly, there's different ways of doing this, but this is a simple, what they call a PEM fuel cell, which is a proton exchange membrane, is what PEM stands for. So you basically have this membrane here, which is actually a series. There's 2 membranes, and then there's electrolyte in the middle. But on one side, you have hydrogen coming in, and the other side, you have air or oxygen coming in. And hydrogen is a really simple molecule, as we saw before. It's basically just 1 hydrogen with 1 electron. This membrane allows the hydrogen, which when the electron is stripped off, the hydrogen now becomes a positive, and it's called a proton. So it allows, and that's why it's called a proton exchange membrane. It allows the hydrogen to go through, the proton, I'm sorry, to go through this. The hydrogen or the electron is stripped off and it can't go through the membrane, but there's a circuit here that connects these 2 electrodes. So the proton goes directly through, and the electron has to catch up with it by following through the circuit. So any kind of electron that's moving through a circuit is electricity, right? So the electrons go through here, create an electric current, and then on this side, they combine with oxygen that comes in from the air, and it makes water. Again, a very simple type of process. We've had one of these things, and we used it. And you start with water over here, right? We had water, and then we use an electrolyzer to make hydrogen and then oxygen. So we started with water, and we end up with water. And there's no carbon at all in this type of process. Very, very elegant, very, very nice, straightforward process.
Brian.
Yeah.
So can you just speak quickly? So the fuel cells can be used in small compact areas to mobilize vehicles, but they can also be really scaled up and used to power mechanical systems for buildings. And right, so there's a really wide array of potential usages, correct?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. And that's what all this is about, right? Is basically the electrification. And that's where we're going. You know, these countries are looking at trying to make these commitments by 2050 or whenever of being carbon neutral. So how do they do that? So they're talking about there's a big uptick in electric vehicles, and that's a good thing. It's heading in the right direction. But even though the vehicle itself is not generating emissions, where is the electricity coming from that is powering, charging up the batteries in these vehicles? That's the issue. So right now, if you're just charging from the grid, it depends where your grid is. If there's coal involved with the grid, it's still contributing to some carbon in the process. However, again, if we take away that carbon and we can make the electricity by hydrogen, by green hydrogen, then there's no carbon involved in that process. So Lisa, you're right. These type of processes can be small. The ones I was playing with are really, really small, but they can be scaled up and used at scale. And they are beginning to be, that is beginning to be done. So that's another encouraging part of why I'm talking about hydrogen 15 years after I first started talking about it. But I'm really a lot more excited about its prospects now than I was 15 years ago. So I alluded to this before. Again, hydrogen can be made a number of ways. It's an industrial chemical, and we use it a lot for a lot of processes, petrochemicals, hydrocracking, a lot of things we use hydrogen for. And the way it's produced, they're starting to put these colors on them. So again, we talked about green hydrogen, which is using electrolysis, as I explained. There's something you'll hear a lot about, blue hydrogen. Okay, so it's hydrogen and it has all the good properties of hydrogen, but as you can see there, it's made by fossil fuels basically. But it's not considered gray or brown or black because blue is supposedly attached to carbon capture and sequestration, or carbon capture and storage. You'll hear a lot of talk about blue hydrogen. I guess in my own mind, I haven't decided yet whether it's good or bad. I've heard it both ways. You'll see a lot of hype on blue by petrochemical, by the oil companies, the big firms, Exxon, Shell, BP. They're all heavily invested in this because, well, it allows their essential product, fossil fuel, right, to continue to be used. But by adding carbon capture to that process, even though you're still burning fossil fuels, carbon capture is a way to take away some of the black color, gray color, or whatever, and make it blue. Carbon capture, we'll talk about that here in a minute, is an area that has been talked about for decades and has very little success with it right now. Theoretically, there's a lot of potential for it. We have a lot of depleted oil and gas fields throughout the world. And by some estimates, if we could re-inject carbon into those depleted fields, we'd have, by some estimates, enough storage for 400 years of carbon in the existing oil and gas fields that have been depleted. So, it sounds interesting. It sounds exciting. But again, the reality is pretty specific to what we're trying to do. Typically, carbon capture should be done at the point of generation, like at a big power plant, where you can capture all the material out of the flue. So it's concentrated, and you can put it directly, process it, and put it directly into the ground at that point. there's a lot of things with it because you have to spend a lot of energy to capture, to treat, to compress, because you have to compress the gas at high pressure, put it back down into the ground. So it's a pretty industrial process. And again, my mind isn't made up, but I'm pretty skeptical about it.
Well, so, and also to be clear, folks, that so this idea of carbon capture and sequestration requires building and scaling up these really massive mammoth plants to do just that. And the folks, many of the same shareholders and investment bankers that are funneling cash into fossil fuel extraction are pretty excited about the idea of being on the other end of this in carbon capture. So it's like I manufacture tobacco and nicotine patches. I'm cashing in on both ends. So just to be clear.
Yeah, they're on both sides of that, aren't they? Yeah. So I wanted to focus on green and blue. I think gray and black are pretty self-evident. This purple, pink, using nukes. They haven't really decided on what the proper coloration is there. Turquoise is another variation where instead of just outright combusting fossil fuels, you use a different thermal distillation process, and you don't make the carbon dioxide, but you're left with an ash, a carbon ash, a solid that is a little bit more manageable. But I do want to talk a little bit about white. So down there, they identify white as a byproduct of industrial processes. So again, you have a big chemical plant, and they're doing whatever they do, and then oh yeah, by the way, they have this side stream of hydrogen. So that's what they would classify as white. So you're doing something else, but you happen to make hydrogen in the process. But there's also, as you see in the lower part, it does occur natural. And this was news to me as of a few years ago. I was always of the mind that hydrogen was always, and I'm a chemical engineer, so I thought I knew this stuff. But hydrogen was always part of a molecule, like water or methane or something like that. You never found hydrogen just by itself. However, they are finding hydrogen just by itself. Actually, I mentioned Paul Williamson. When he moved on from his position at Missoula College, he went to Colorado and is working with some other people in alternative energy. And this one company he got affiliated with is drilling some wells in Canada. It happens to be, I don't remember exactly where. And they found naturally occurring pure hydrogen. I don't know how pure it is. I don't think it's anything that's naturally occurring usually isn't very pure. So, but anyway, it's not combined. If they're able to bring it up in basically its native form, and people are thinking or realizing that this may not be as rare as we once thought it is. They haven't really looked for it because nobody like me ever believed that it was even out there to be found. And now, that sort of mindset is changing. And now they're starting to think, where can we find this naturally occurring hydrogen? And some people think that it's fairly abundant and some people don't. So it's an emerging field, and it could be pretty exciting. Here you wouldn't be using water, man. You just like we do with natural gas, you just bring the fuel straight up out of the ground, and it's ready to be used. So I mentioned carbon capture. This is, as Lisa alluded to, it's a pretty industrial process. It requires big equipment, big money, drilling wells or reusing wells, and finding these reservoirs, these subterranean reservoirs that can accept it. And each situation is fairly unique. So it's something that, you know, has to be independently or custom made, I guess, for any situation you look at it. This is geologic carbon capture. There are other forms, and talk about one right here, is what they call direct air carbon capture. Now this is a company, a petroleum company, Occidental, out of California. They are in the process of investing billions of dollars into this process. Again, it's fairly industrial. Now, all this is doing is sucking air. Think of it as a vacuum cleaner, right? This isn't next to a power plant where they're taking the effluent from the smokestack down into a process. This is just sucking up your atmosphere and processing it. So CO2 in the atmosphere, even though it's increasing, even though it's getting to fairly important levels, it's still a very dilute gas. So in order to do this, they have to process massive amounts of air in order to capture, you know, the carbon dioxide that resides in it. But they're endeavoring to do this. They think they've got a process ironed out that they're going to be building. You know, at this point in time, they're only building their first one right now. It's not done yet. So we'll see how this proceeds. But you know, they've at least made representations to their shareholders that they're going to be building 70 of these plants in the next, you know, 5 to 10 years.
I ask, so yeah. is the theory behind this that they're actually just cleaning the atmosphere around us as we're emitting? It's cleaning and capturing?
Yeah.
Wow.
I mean, it's basically it's not even it's not tied to any emissions. It's just
general.
Yeah, and you know, and you can't find, like, okay, in this part of the world we have a big concentration of CO or CO2. It's just everywhere. So it really doesn't matter where you put them, right? Because it's an interesting process. And again, I'm a little skeptical about it, but they're investing, you know, a few billion dollars into it. So we'll see how it goes. And because I'm a chemical engineer, I put the chemical formula up there. So again, it's an industrial process. It's a fairly simple one. KOH is potassium hydroxide, and you just, and it's a liquid. So you have, and I don't know what they're doing in there. I haven't seen, you know, the insides of this process. So I don't know how, but somehow they're contacting gaseous CO2 with liquid potassium hydroxide, and the chemical reaction produces a solid, which is potassium carbonate and water. So the solid can be separated, and you know, it's the carbon is now a solid, so it can be managed in a different way than CO2 gases. There is limited use for potassium carbonate. They used to use it for cooking and baking at some point. I think they use it for some drying purposes. It doesn't have much of an industrial use for it, but maybe something will develop if we're going to be producing tons and tons of this stuff in the near future. Then, you know, perhaps industry will catch up and find some creative way of employing that type of material. So this is interesting. I mentioned before that how much time do we have, Lisa? About
let me just take a peek here. So probably about another 10 to 12 minutes.
Okay. Let me run through this pretty quick. We're building a combined heat and power plant here at the university. So we're going to be making our own electricity for the first time, and we're going to be using natural gas to do that. So obviously natural gas is a fossil fuel. We'll still have a carbon footprint associated with it. But because we're moving off the grid of Northwestern Energy, which uses coal in some of their production, Natural gas, as you saw before in that combustion analysis, is the cleanest fossil fuel. If you're using natural gas, you're using mostly methane, and you're producing the least amount of carbon dioxide in your combustion. So that's what we'll be doing at the combined heat and power plant on the university. However, these turbines, these gas turbines that will be producing electricity have been selected by us because their design can be easily switched from natural gas to hydrogen. So again, you know, we're trying to decarbonize, right? And even by stepping into producing our electricity from natural gas, we will be decarbonizing our footprint. We'll be reducing it by 1/3 approximately. Now, if we can get hydrogen into that, into our combined heat and power plant, well, you know, our carbon's gone. How do we get hydrogen in there? Well, this is interesting. This is in Delta, Utah, a little bit south of 100 miles maybe south of Salt Lake City, in the middle of Utah desert. This is their largest power plant. It's a coal-fired power plant. I think it's 1,800 megawatt coal-fired plant. Mitsubishi, which is a big Japanese industrial firm, I'm sure you've all heard of them. They are taking this over, and they are going to make it a hydrogen electric station. Now, what they're doing is they're going to have gas turbines, like I just talked about. We're going to have very small ones here at the university. They're going to have really large ones there. But hydrogen, again, is a gas that can be burned. So they're going to burn it. They're going to spin turbines and make energy there. So it's going to drop from 1,800 megawatts to about 840. So they're going to lose about 1,000 megawatts by doing this. But they're going to be making it, it's going to start out with a combination of natural gas combined with hydrogen. So they're going to take it off of coal, which is a good step. They're going to use natural gas. Okay, so it's still a fossil fuel. They're going to add hydrogen to it. So they're going to green up that fossil fuel. Over time, it's going to be 100% hydrogen. And the way they're going to do that is, oops. Right below that area that I just showed you is massive salt caverns. And they are going to mine these salt caverns. The way you mine a salt cavern is you just pump water in it. It drills out creates a void. And that's what they're going to use as a storage container. And you can see the relative size of the salt dome to the Empire State Building there. So that power plant is sitting on top of this massive salt dome. So Mitsubishi has a plan to, there's a lot of water in that area right nearby. They're going to produce hydrogen through electrolysis right on that location. They're going to store some of it in this cavern. And they're also looking at from Butte, Montana, all the way down the I-15 corridor, building a hydrogen pipeline that goes from Butte. So the plan is to use the Berkeley pit, the polluted water that's sitting in the Berkeley pit. They're going to use that as fuel to the water in order to electrolyze and make hydrogen with. And they're going to take that hydrogen down to this location. They're also going to do that with other locations in and around this big geographic area. I didn't talk to Mitsubishi, although I did try, but I did talk to somebody in Butte who's involved with this project, and I said, hey, you know, how about you lay another couple 100 miles of pipeline over to Missoula, Montana, and you know we'll take your hydrogen and we'll use it in our combined heat and power plant. So, you know, I don't know. I planted that bug. I don't think it'll go anywhere, but it's out there anyway.
What kind of investment is this?
It's big. I don't really have big numbers, or I don't have good numbers on it. But you know, it's a pretty big operation.
Okay.
So sorry, in the interest of time, we've really only got probably another like 3 or 4 minutes. Can you just, so this is, I mean, super exciting, yeah, because those of us that have been hearing about the potential in hydrogen, like you said, have been hearing about it for a long time. Can you just maybe in the last 3 or 4 minutes, I mean, we don't need charts or anything, but just give us a quick overview of where solar and wind are in the overall picture in the portfolio as pertains to the United States. And again, I know that you probably don't have data at the tip of your fingers, but just so that we get kind of an overview of all the different potential technologies, that would probably be the best thing to focus on, maybe the last 5 minutes.
Sure. Yeah.
Thanks.
Well, definitely, solar is picking up, and yeah, you're right. I don't have the latest numbers, but it's increasing. It's been increasing. There continues to be government incentives to help it continue to increase, and that's a good thing. Wind is increasing as well. Not only is it increasing, but both of those technologies are becoming cheaper. The initial capital costs are diminishing, so that at this point in time, they've reached or even exceeded the parity with fossil fuel type of electrical production. There's still climate issues associated with both of those. I mean, besides the aesthetic features of, big turbines outside of somebody's window that they don't particularly like to see, the cost of mining those materials, the cost of fabricating those materials, solar, even though it's a really beautiful technology, does use a lot of energy in order to create. They're getting better. They're using more advanced materials. They keep doing incredible research on that. So again, you'll see, I think the type of materials go from, toxic heavy metals to more ecologically friendly metals, more recyclable type of things. Different types of processes don't require so much high heat and highly refined silicon. You'll see all those things incorporated in the new technologies. Just cut me off here. I just wanted to mention this very quickly. Part of the electrification is, at my house, I have a gas furnace, I have a gas water heater, and I have a gas stove. And I have a gas dryer, a clothes dryer. There's new things out there, heat pumps, you've heard of them. Here's a quick little thing of how they work. They're becoming more and more effective, more and more efficient. They're more expensive, so that's preventing them from getting making market penetration. And here you can see, but they are becoming a better fit for what we do, even in cold climates. I mean, these things work pretty well in more moderate parts of the U.S., but even in places like Montana, Minnesota, places like that, where we get fairly significant long cold weather, there's new technologies that are coming out. This is kind of showing what kind of incentives might be required in order to match existing technologies. But they're out there, they work well. And, I built an apartment with just a heat pump on it, and it works very well. Wanted to put a heat pump, clothes dryer in there. My wife wouldn't let me, so I didn't get that part done. But again, these technologies are out there, they work, and they're getting better, and their costs are coming down. So this is part of the concept of decarbonizing and electrifying our economy. And with that, I'll let you shut me off.
Great. Wow, thanks. Take the screen off so I can see you again, if you would, please.
Oh, yeah.
Thanks. So just to be clear, you guys, I'm going to put out a number of questions or additional topics, things to think about as relates to Brian's conversation today. I know some of the chemistry might have been, a little heavy, since some of us don't have a science background. I really have to focus to follow everything myself. But I want you to think about this whole idea of incentivization and how government subsidies can help jumpstart some of these newer technologies, make them more widely acceptable, make them make the behavior and the incorporation of them into, you know, individual homes and commercial scale operations more manageable, encourage companies to you know, invest capital into developing companies that, you know, widely disperse these types of technologies. Just kind of have a think about how businesses individually can incorporate some of these ideas either as the source of capital or employing them in their own operations. So lots of exciting potential, and it is all leading towards this magic idea of complete decarbonization. So thank you so much, Brian. Really great information. And I know this is all sort of weird, just the two of us sitting here, but I really appreciate it. And I put your email up on the chat. So if anybody wants to contact Brian, it's just brian.kearns@umontana.edu. And with any further questions, please do so. So thank you so much, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you, Lisa. Yeah, and I'll give you my slide deck if you want to include that.
Yes. Oh, please. Yeah, just go ahead and you can either email it to me. Yeah, that's probably the easiest, is email it to me and then I'll plop it in Moodle.
Very good.
Okay, cool. Thanks so much. Take
Thank you.
care.
You too.
Bye.